June 4, 1943, Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia. The morning haze clung to the harbor as German prisoners of war shuffled down the gangplanks after 2 weeks at sea. Among them was Unteroffizier Hermann Bircher. His legs wobbled, unsteady from the long Atlantic crossing, but his mind was steady enough to take in what he was seeing, and none of it matched the 3 years of Nazi propaganda he had been fed. Across the bustling docks, white and black American workers labored side by side, loading and unloading cargo with giant cranes that looked like something from another century. Women in coveralls operated machinery with confidence, while children hawked newspapers at the gates. A brass band played lively tunes for a war bond rally within sight of warships. Civilians wandered freely near one of America's largest naval bases, seemingly unbothered by the presence of thousands of enemy soldiers. Hermann turned to the man behind him and muttered under his breath in disbelief, "Die spinning, die Amerik. The Americans are crazy." He would later write about this moment in his memoir, Behind Barbed Wire, published in 1952. It became one of the most detailed first-hand accounts of German prisoners of war held in the United States. What stunned him that day wasn't just the sheer scale of the Norfolk base. Over 4,000 acres of docks and warehouses, dozens of ships being loaded simultaneously. It was the normally. Here was a nation at war, yet behaving as if war hardly touched them. By the end of the war, over 425,000 German prisoners would be brought to camps across America, and what they saw in those years wouldn't just challenge their loyalty to Hitler, it would shake the very foundations of Nazi ideology. The processing began almost immediately. Butcher described it as the first impossibility. In Germany, prisoners were treated as assets to exploit or burdens to minimize. The Geneva Convention was acknowledged only when convenient. But here at Norfolk, American officers read the Geneva Convention rules aloud in fluent German, explaining rights, even dietary accommodations. Red Cross packages were handed out, and Jewish American soldiers, men with surnames that would have been death sentences in Germany, explained that kosher meals were available for Jewish prisoners. Some Germans laughed nervously, certain it was mockery. It wasn't. Then came the medical inspections. Wounded Germans were given the same penicillin that was nearly non-existent in their own field hospitals. Prisoners with infections or injuries were treated with the same urgency and quality of care as American soldiers. A Swiss Red Cross inspector even noted that the medical treatment provided to German PSWs equaled or exceeded that given to American servicemen. Even more jarring, some of the medics were African-American. One German officer later admitted the shock of having his blood drawn by a black technician, a simple everyday act in America that was legally forbidden in Nazi Germany. The shock deepened when they were escorted into the mess hall. Germans and Americans ate under the same roof, not the same tables but the same facility, the same food, the same lines. While German sailors picked up trays of steaming meals, American sailors nearby laughed at a baseball game on the radio, barely acknowledging the presence of their supposed enemies. The journey inland only amplified the disbelief. German PS weren't crammed into boxcars, but seated in cushioned passenger coaches. The trains stopped at major stations, and civilians came to watch. In Washington, D.C.'s Union Station, German prisoners looked out the windows at American families, wives kissing husbands goodbye in public, children waving flags, teenagers laughing over milkshakes. And all of this happened just feet away from enemy soldiers under light guard. Even America's factories didn't hide. In Germany, every factory was camouflaged. But here, the Glen L. Martin aircraft plant in Baltimore sat wide open, its parking lots full of workers' cars, its bombers lined up in plain view. Steel mills glowed in the night sky, unbothered by the thought of spies. America was producing more than Germany could dream of, and they weren't afraid to let the enemy see it. By the time the prisoners reached Camp Hearn in Texas, many were reeling from what they had seen, and the camp itself only deepened the confusion. Instead of straw pallets, there were wooden barracks with electric lights, indoor plumbing, and hot showers. Instead of bare survival, there were mattresses, sheets, and blankets. Recreation halls had ping-pong tables, musical instruments, even libraries. Lieutenant Colonel Sile Stiles, the camp commander, spoke fluent German. He addressed the prisoners with authority, but also explained something almost impossible for them to understand. They would be allowed to elect their own spokesman, organize activities, even govern themselves, within the camp's rules. For men raised on rigid hierarchy and fear, this sounded like either weakness or a trick, but it wasn't. Over time, German prisoners began to experience freedoms they had never known in their own country. They were allowed to work on local farms, earning scrip to spend in camp canteens that sold chocolate, cigarettes, and even musical instruments. They labored at Texas, ranches so large they dwarfed entire German states, alongside Mexican-American and black workers whose very existence defied Nazi racial ideology. At Christmas time in 1943, the entire town of Hearn mobilized to provide holiday gifts for their enemies. Veterans of World War I donated candy and cigarettes to men who had once tried to kill them. The camp served a Christmas feast that outstripped anything Germans had eaten in years. Roast turkey, ham, sweet potatoes, pies, even beer and wine. The shock was too much for some. Prisoners cried openly. In that moment, many began to question everything they had been taught. Day after day, the contradictions mounted. They saw African-American guards command respect, even as those same men were denied service at local restaurants where German prisoners were welcome. They heard American farmers openly criticize Roosevelt and the government without fear of reprisal, something unthinkable in Germany. They read American newspapers that included opposition voices, mocking cartoons of the president, and reports of setbacks at the front. Democracy didn't just survive criticism, it thrived on it. Slowly, the transformation began. Men who had once sworn oaths to Hitler started reading banned German novels in the camp library. Some took college courses through American universities. Camp newspapers shifted from Nazi propaganda to discussions of democracy. Prisoners who had believed themselves racially superior now worked alongside black and Mexican laborers who often outperformed them in the fields. Herman Birch, the same man who had once whispered, "The Americans are crazy," later wrote that the real turning point came at that Christmas celebration. These people whose sons we had tried to kill gave us gifts. Their kindness wasn't weakness. It was strength, the strength of victors who knew they had already won. Not just the war, but the peace to follow. When the war ended, most German prisoners returned home, but they did not return unchanged. Many had come to see America not as a weak, decadent nation, but as a country whose chaotic freedom and abundance were its greatest strength. Thousands of them carried these lessons into post-war Germany. Some even returned permanently, immigrating to the U.S., marrying Americans and raising families. By 1946, America had held nearly 500,000 German PSWs. Less than 1% ever tried to escape, and decades later, surveys showed that the majority of these former prisoners held positive views of democracy and America. Many became leaders in West Germany's reconstruction, playing roles in what would become the foundation of the Transatlantic Alliance. The story of German prisoners of war in America is more than just a footnote of World War II. It is a reminder that sometimes the greatest victories are not won on the battlefield, but in the quiet power of example. America defeated Nazi Germany with tanks, planes, and ships. But it also defeated Nazism in the minds of men through something far simpler: humanity. The German soldiers came expecting to see weakness. Instead, they saw a nation so confident in its strength that it could afford mercy. They came as enemies. Many left as admirers. Some even left as friends. And that transformation